Good morning, good evening and good afternoon to everyone wherever you're joining us. I don't know if you missed any part of what I just shared, but I will just welcome you again on behalf of the Gerhardt Center for Philanthropy, Civic Engagement and Responsible Business, African Philanthropy Forum and Bridgespan. We're excited to have you at this edition of the Gerhardt webinar series. My name is Mosun Layode and I serve as the Executive Director at the African Philanthropy Forum. With me today are Schwier, Hayi-Charters, and Maddie Holland from the Bridgespan group. Together, we co-authored a report that we're going to be discussing today, and we're excited that this is the first time that we're having this public conversation on this report. I will just start 1 minute. I just want to share. If you just hold on a minute, please. Okay. Sorry about that. My screen is being obscured. But just to share with you that APF and Bridgespan are particularly excited to be here today. And we collaborated on this research project in late 2020 because of our commitment to supporting the growth of a vibrant social sector in Africa, if I'll put it that way. Our goal was to better understand the nuances within the African philanthropic ecosystem, surface the barriers facing African NGOs, and as they seek funding from both African and non-African funders, and share workable solutions that exist to unlock more funding for African NGOs. During the project, approximately 60 interviews were conducted with stakeholders across all geographies. We focused on conducting these interviews with funders, NGOs, and intermediaries, all working on the African continent. We also conducted interviews and we received responses from over 50 organizations, primarily philanthropic funders on the African continent and funders, international funders that fund projects on the African continent. The outcome of this is a report co-authored by APF and Bridgespan. Today, we're really honored and thrilled that you could join us for, as I earlier said, the first public discussion on this report and what I'm calling a pre-launch. During the course of this webinar, we will present the findings of the research project and have the opportunity to engage with one of the leading philanthropists in Africa, my personal favorite philanthropist in Africa, Tsitsi Masiyiwa. She's the executive chair and co-founder of Higher Life Foundation, and we at APF also have the honor and privilege to have her as our board chair. Finally, we're going to have the wonderful opportunity to interact with you all during Q&A. We would love for you to stay interactive all through the process, so keep the comments coming in the comment section. Don't wait until Q&A before you engage with us today. At this point, I will hand over to Sia, who would present the research findings. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mosun. So we thought we would just share some high-level insights from our research just to orientate this conversation, just in case you haven't had the chance to read the full report. So really the genesis of this piece was research that we published last year out of our Bridgespan Johannesburg office on the landscape of large-scale giving by African philanthropists. So essentially what that research sought to do was to identify large gifts by African philanthropists, and that is gifts of $1 million or more between the years 2010 and 2019, and see where these gifts were being directed. Once we had that database put together, we compared it to similar research that has been done by Bridgespan globally, looking at where non-African funders are directing their large gifts on the continent. So one of the key findings of that research last year was that a very modest share of African and non-African philanthropists' large giving is reaching African NGOs. And when looking at these two funder segments, what we found on the African funder side was that a lot of large gifts were being directed to public sector entities, as well as to direct implementation of initiatives through funders' own operating foundations. And only 9% of large-scale funding was reaching African NGOs. And what we heard were some of the drivers here were that, African funders saw the opportunity to scale some of their impact through working with governments, and also a need for greater oversight of where their funding is going by engaging in direct implementation. On the non-African funder side, what we found was that a lot of these funders were directing their large gifts to international NGOs with whom they had had long-standing relationships, and only 14% of funding was reaching African NGOs. And here we heard issues of a lack of trust in the local NGO sector. We updated our database in 2020, just given the great response to COVID-19 from African funders. But what we found is that during that year, even though African funders gave significant gifts, the share going to African NGOs was still very modest at 9%, with most of the funding being directed to specialized COVID-19 relief funds. So this data point really prompted African Philanthropy Forum and Bridgespan to partner together to better understand what is driving this dynamic. And that is how we arrived at the piece that we published this year on disparities in funding for African NGOs. So Mosun has touched on our partnership and the vantage points that our organizations bring to this conversation, as well as the process that we went through to research some of the drivers of this dynamic. So I'll just move on to some of the key findings that we want to highlight today on this research. One of the first questions that we sought to answer in doing this research was how the field even goes about defining what an African NGO is. Our initial research had anchored on headquarters location, but we understood that this question is very nuanced and different actors think about it differently. So what we found during our interviews and in our survey was that sector players think about defining an African NGO by looking at various parameters. But what these parameters have in common is that they center around where decision-making power sits. So interviewers and respondents told us that they look at forums like the leadership team and the board and governance of an NGO to see how much representation of African nationals lies in those forums. Another important parameter was around an organization's operating model and decision-making structure, and how these account for local practices and processes in how decisions are made. Community engagement was another important factor that people consider, looking at how much community input is baked into organizations' initiatives. Finally, headquarters location remained an important proxy for what constitutes an African NGO. The crux of the report really then looked at identifying what barriers stand in the way of African NGOs receiving more funding from both African and non-African philanthropists. And we also sought to identify solutions to each of these barriers. An important framework, or very useful framework, that we found in identifying these barriers and solutions was looking at the grant-making value chain, from when grant-making strategies are set through to the types of funding and ongoing supports that funders give to African NGOs. And so starting at this question of strategy or strategic alignment, what we found in terms of barriers here was that many funders did not even have an intention or stated strategy to fund African NGOs, or where funders did have this intention, they hadn't put in place processes and goals to live into this intention. So potential solutions that were surfaced here was really organizations setting clear goals or targets for funding African NGOs and communicating these goals to others that would hold them accountable. And really regular reviewing of portfolios to identify where some of the strategic misalignment may lie. What we also heard was that even where organizations have an intention to fund African NGOs, where they often struggle is finding these NGOs to fund. And the solutions that were surfaced here were around broadening donors' sourcing networks to include more local voices like local funders, local incubators, or even other NGO leaders as potential sourcing references. We also heard that organizations' sourcing practices also need to be changed to broaden the types of organizations being surfaced, such as being able to accept grant proposals in indigenous languages, as well as accepting equivalency determinations where donors require organizations to be internationally registered. So moving on to diligence and selection, what we heard here was that even where African organizations are surfaced through sourcing networks, they often fall out of contention in the diligence and selection processes. And here, sector stakeholders really proposed that funders start revising their grant-making criteria to give credit to the unique assets of African NGOs, such as their unmatched knowledge of their local context, as well as their staying power and commitment to the communities that they serve. Also, what we heard was that sometimes these grant-making processes can be these diligence processes can be unduly burdensome. And so having decision-making proximity and sort of local context there can help to right-size the sort of diligence criteria that organizations put in place. And then finally, just on this grant-making value chain, when it came to funding and ongoing support of African NGOs that had managed to secure funding, what we heard here was that these organizations tend to receive very small, short-term and restricted grants. And really there, we sought to challenge funders to start giving unrestricted funding to African NGOs so that they can invest in building resilient organizations, as well as giving multi-year funding to enable organizations to plan for the longer term and to also get over this hurdle of absorptive capacity that was continuously raised in respect of African organizations. Finally, we heard that bias is an issue that undercuts the entire grant-making process, with people surfacing racial, cultural, and familiarity biases that tend to drive a mistrust in local NGOs and their leaders. And so here, potential solutions that were surfaced was ensuring greater diversity and representation in leadership and decision-making structures within funders, and also instituting some checks and balances to really pick up areas of bias in grant-making and addressing these areas. So those are some of the key findings of our report, and I'll hand over now to Jan to run the conversation with Tsitsi, but we welcome any questions that you may have on some of these findings in the chat.
Great. Thank you so much, Sia. And Tsitsi, thank you so much for making yourself available for this discussion. We really look forward to speaking to you. It's a great privilege.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited and actually very blessed to be part of this fireside chat.
Yes. It's been wonderful to work with the African Philanthropy Forum on this research that our colleague gave a bit of an overview on, especially since APF has such a deep experience and knowledge across the philanthropic ecosystem in Africa. And as we've heard, the report outlines what both African and non-African philanthropists can do to better support what we've called proximate African organizations. And I'd like to focus the discussion with you specifically on the role of African philanthropy in this context. And since you've been working in philanthropy in Africa for so many years, I thought it would be most exciting to start maybe with some personal observations of yours. And I wanted to start by asking you, what are some of the trends and changes in African philanthropy over the past years that you've observed that strike you the most? And what are you most excited about as you look at the African philanthropy sector today?
Thanks, Jan. There are lots of exciting things that are happening, and I'm just so glad about the report that Bridgespan, in partnership with the African Philanthropy Forum, has done to just bring out the state of, I think, the challenges that hold some of our NGOs back and the relationships between the African philanthropists and local NGOs. But what excites me about African philanthropy is, number one, we see that it's generally families are involved in the whole practice of philanthropy. There's always excitement and real participation that comes out of families. So a lot of the, quite a number of our members in the African Philanthropy Forum, although we may primarily see the main philanthropist, the parent or parents, but we also see next generation being very much involved. My own family is in exactly that same position. So that's really exciting, because it means that we have built in a sustainability. We are taking a long-term view. We are looking at beyond our current generation and looking at next generation. So our actions, our perceptions, whatever our decisions are very much driven by a long-term perspective and also ideas from the next generation. I'm also very excited on one hand, but I think it comes out of what we saw during especially the tragic events around George Floyd, the killing, and then the subsequent literal uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think what they have done, unfortunately, it took us, the death of a father and, a dear member of a family to bring out, I think, something that we could have done long before. So, which is that there's a much more dignified way in which we are discussing very difficult issues and sharing our pain points, which I see that as something that I really cherish, which is important, and discussing those difficult issues without foregoing the possibility of losing partners or just becoming like an outlier or a spoiler. So difficult conversations we've not had that platform before. And we are seeing it more and more, not just internally as African philanthropists, but I think globally, there is a willingness to tackle and to see ways in which we can move forward collectively. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Tsitsi. It takes me to the next question that I had. I'm sure you and your colleagues and other philanthropists also that are part of the effort around what the African philanthropy tries to promote and develop are also discussing what are some of the challenges that are still ahead that preoccupy you the most. What are some of those challenges that you would say that is what I see ahead for us, what still has to be addressed when you think about African philanthropy in the years ahead.
Sure. So I'm just going to talk and maybe focus on some of the things that I've come across as we go about doing our work on the ground, and also trying to build those relationships with local NGOs. So some of the struggles, I think, number one, are how do we, as African philanthropists, find ways in which we can work with local NGOs who are used to receiving funding from international donors in US dollars, where everything is pegged in a foreign currency. So there's an expectation of everything being driven in dollar terms. Number one. Number two, how do we make it attractive also and affordable, especially where sometimes local NGOs work with consultants that are very expensive and generally are not based on the continent or based in country, but have a lot of say in what is done locally. So it's that has been a challenge in the past. So where you end up having local organizations trying to either please their principals, potential donors, in order to secure funding, chopping and changing vision and mission, and what are the real, and the articulation of needs on the ground in order to secure funding. And then coupled with that, the just lack of certainty in terms of how long funding lasts. So sometimes it's cyclical according to the government in office. If it's a well-liked government that likes giving, you have more opportunities. The minute a new one comes into office, everything changes. We've seen that happen with the US. We've seen that happen with the UK, and honestly, it makes it very difficult for even African philanthropy to respond to the needs on the ground. The positive thing is with African philanthropy is we are there to stay. I think our existence in the sector is more long-term. Many of us are first-generation wealth creators or high net worth individuals. Majority have not retired and inherited money from somewhere. Majority of us philanthropists are actually engaged in business and also in philanthropy at the same time. So it's because you see that the need is very great, and also the desire to give something in our lifetime is also very strong. So some of those challenges then arise where if you're in it for the long term, how do you find partners that are looking long term? An example I'll give is when we think of how we do our work in our foundations, whether it's High Life Foundation or Delta Philanthropies, we are thinking 2050, 2070. Why? We work with young people. And young people's just the years in which they spend in school is between 13 and 18 years. So if you're giving a scholarship, we're not giving a scholarship every 3 years. If you're given as a 5-year-old, it takes you to, if you get to university, all the way to university. So we are, so we by nature have to think long term, but it's not necessarily the case, I think, when you're working with INGOs. So that's one perspective. And then another one is, I think a great challenge is qualified staff. It's very difficult. It's a competitive sector, and you always find that the most highly qualified personnel will go for the international jobs and international NGOs. And also, the salaries are incomparable. They're very well paid, even though some of the job securities that some of the local African philanthropists offer are way better. But they pay in local currency, and sometimes, and they just don't have some, I think the kind of high salaries that INGOs pay. So we are always losing qualified staff, even if we are quite attractive. There are ways in which we find, you find ways of dealing with that, but it is a challenge.
Yeah, I think all of that resonates. I think we've heard this in many of the discussions that we've had that led to this report. I think especially the issue of short-term funding, restrictions on funding, I think all of those issues very much resonate. Kind of brings me to the next topic that I wanted to get your perspective on. The report puts a lot of emphasis on the specific topic of funding African NGOs. And one of the findings that we had from this data that we were able to put together is that only a relatively small share of both international, but especially also large African philanthropic money seems to reach NGOs, which much of it instead from African philanthropists seemingly going to operating foundations, so staying much closer to the philanthropic foundation or individual, or going to the public sector. But at the same time, we heard time and time again, and I think we try to acknowledge this also, how critically important African philanthropy is. And there are a number of funders who are already supporting African NGOs with really large and strategic gifts. You are one of those funders. There's others also that we've laid out. You mentioned already, and this is my question, African philanthropy is here to stay. You talked about the 2050 to 2070 perspective that you have. When you think about what is the unique role that homegrown African philanthropy plays for African NGOs that international funders either can't or are just not as well equipped to play, are those the two central elements? You're vested in the continent, you take a much longer term perspective. Are there other things that are just unique that you would want to point out from your perspective?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that excited me about this particular webinar is that it's being hosted by the American University in Cairo, and it's a center for philanthropy. Now, I'm only aware of 2 centers on the continent, one in Johannesburg and one in Cairo. Now, 54 countries, there's no way we can really build sustainable African philanthropy when you have only 2 centers of knowledge. So we need to, as to the extent that we can, to literally have in every country, you should have undergraduate programs that teach philanthropy, master's programs, PhDs, research that is done, and to build a sector that has a lot of knowledge and also that collects a lot of knowledge, data, and information. That makes, I personally believe, makes philanthropy very sustainable in the West. You have so many universities that understand the history, what works, what doesn't work. There are case studies that have been written. You can build expertise around how to do fundraising, to strategic plans, to project management, all sorts of issues. But on the continent, we are having to do it, honestly, it's very difficult. Majority of people, we don't have a common definition of, so what is African philanthropy? It's something that we are constantly having to verbalize and speak about and what have you. So to build that capacity, it's so important to invest in generation of knowledge and structures that facilitate the ability to build knowledge and to build skills. And so that we end up with a sector that and a good pipeline of leadership of people with competencies in philanthropy, etc. That's, I believe, is absolutely critical. Even if you have many high net worth individuals, we will not get there without that ecosystem around knowledge and skills development and development of competencies around African philanthropy. Then also, I think the second area which I think can really facilitate is how do we get the media to build an appetite to carry and focus on stories that inspire and that motivate and that help more Africans to be interested in the sector. There's so little that is written. So most of the time, an impression is created that maybe there are many high net worth individuals on the African continent that are just not interested in parting with their money. But we saw with COVID, literally from the African Philanthropy Forum, literally every African country had a cohort of African philanthropists, local, who built hospitals, who funded PPE, tests, and just facilitated in ensuring that we would minimize the impact of COVID in terms of death and job losses and income losses and all that. So the potential exists, the appetite is there, the interest is there. Is how do we ensure that we build a system that is post the crisis, so that we take advantage of the momentum we've already begun to build. I'm also very happy that Bridgespan has opened an office in Johannesburg. I hope you're there to stay. And I think if you also open a few more, there is an important role. Consultants are expensive, but there's an important role that consultants do bring in, because especially if they're on the ground, in country, understand the local culture, and also write more, contribute research and knowledge in global or international journals and reviews and what have you. That also helps to stimulate and improve that access to knowledge and information on what's actually happening on the continent. Yeah.
Great. I could take us now into 12 different directions, but I'm going to stick to two things. One, I'm so happy that you mentioned also the WITS Center for Philanthropy, which is such a equally excellent institution also.
Yeah.
And our work has so greatly benefited from what they're doing. But I think you've pointed out what is in between. This is a huge continent.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. Knowledge, inspiration, understanding of what to do.
Yeah.
We've already talked about that. You're one of those grant makers that we found in this data of making large substantive gifts. I've mentioned a few others. The ACT Foundation, for example, was one example, the Wraith Foundation. In addition to what you've spoken about, knowledge, understanding, inspiration, creating more of a feel that makes African philanthropists want to do this. What else is there in your mind that we need to think about hard and put more information out to unlock more of these large gifts? What else have you seen over the years that you think could drive that, in addition to what you've already mentioned?
So it's thinking outside the box. I think sometimes there's a tendency for us to make an assumption that if somebody is high net worth, then automatically they become a philanthropist. Not necessarily. So I'm involved in the Gender Fund, which is currently being managed by Co-Impact. It's Melinda Gates' vision. Now, their vision is to raise $1 billion for women and girls. So when they began talking to me about what can African philanthropists do, in fact, their question was, what can you, Tsitsi, do as an individual? And I said, if we keep looking to individuals, it's unsustainable, because you are going to the same individuals. What we need to do is to take the hard and difficult road of how do we find new philanthropists who don't know any project, don't know that they are, but they know they are generous and want to share their wealth and make an impact. So what is we decided is the African cohort is we decided we're going to go out and find them. And guess where we found them? They're everywhere on the continent, but we found so many of them in the diaspora. So you have amazing individuals who are ready and willing to partner with existing philanthropists. They're not looking to start to build foundations or offices or hire staff and what have you. They're looking for existing foundations who they partner with and want to invest in projects and ideas that really have impact. So we went out to look. So we partnered. Again, we went to the private sector because the private sector has a good database of who's out there, who has done what, who has made money, and who are the high net worth individuals. We approached a handful, less than 20, did a couple of presentations. And honestly, literally all of them turned around and said, we are interested in partnering and giving funding towards the African core of the Gender Fund. We built in flexibility, which is also important. In the past, when you're approached by a partner, say you are an African philanthropist and there's a European or an American philanthropist, their mindset is, give me the money, let me take it to America, into a bank account in America, then we will send the money back after we've identified the organizations. And I think your report is excellent in putting an end to that nonsense. It really is. From day one, I said it's nonsensical. We do business on the African continent. We generate money in local currency. Why on earth would you ask me to convert that, send it to the US, and then you decide where to send it? Before it didn't make any sense, but I'm so glad now there's a real respect for local currencies. We have to respect all currencies. The US dollar does exactly the same thing as the shilling, does the same thing as the rupee, does the same thing as the South African rand. It really doesn't matter. So for me, it's important thinking outside the box and then putting in place structures that allow you to receive funding in those different currencies, because it's also cheaper and easier. Once you've got an account open in Nairobi or in Lagos, and then you partner with somebody who's bringing their dollars, the local philanthropists will feel respected and they will feel there's a dignity in respecting how people want to do their giving. But if you feel like you are an inconvenience because you're mentioning that, well, we do business on the continent, that's where, that's how we earn our money. Sometimes people are then put off. So we've been able to identify a lot of them, and I take a long-term view. I have to be honest, I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see an amazing cohort of high net worth individuals or families that are more than willing to share, as long as we create the right mechanisms to allow them to do their giving. They are ready to invest in development and improvement of lives on the continent.
Great. I love it. I love the stop this nonsense. I think you're putting it straight, Tsitsi. I think this is great.
In a nice way, though. No, the people are not nonsense. Yes. It's the practice that's
yeah. The practice, exactly. I wanted to come back to this growth of African philanthropy and this phenomenon that we also saw, in that there's so much philanthropy that happens within what we called operating foundations. And if I take a bit the perspective of being a leader of an African NGO, I can of course ask myself, well, where am I in this? How can I get more access through grant making so that my organization can also benefit? You took a specific decision to create Delta Philanthropies as a grant making entity in addition. And our understanding is you made that as a quite deliberate decision to create this vehicle a couple of years ago. What motivated this decision, and what needs to happen so that maybe more philanthropists make similar structural decisions to become grant makers at a larger scale?
So what I realized was that they were, first of all, that living in the UK, that there was the regulatory environment was conducive for us to set up a structure in the UK. There are all sorts of tax benefits and also incentives that allow you to do even more. Number one. Number two, it allowed other partners to find a way in which they can channel their funding through us and to give to various communities. Then number 3, which I think is really sad, when people hear you have an account in the UK, they're more willing to part with their money and give you directly. If you say no, it's in Uganda or it's in Kenya, then people are a little bit cautious in terms of that. So having that kind of structure allowed us to be able to become attractive, not just incentives-wise, but also to get other partners. And then on the other side, it also gave us an opportunity to, we realized that we can't be all things to all men, that there are certain areas in which we are good at, but there are also certain areas where a smaller local NGO is good at. So by giving grants out of Delta Philanthropies UK, it allowed us to take a step back and look at who's out there who is doing things at a smaller scale than we are, and also more with greater impact. So I'll give an example of one particular project. It was during COVID, and in fact, it's 2 organizations based in 2 different cities that had the capacity to quickly take one hospital that had been lying idle for years, another one had been closed for a number of years. They needed money to quickly turn those hospitals around, open them, equip them quickly, and be able to, to get patients in. So what we provided, our grants were catalytic funding. So the things that other donors are not willing to fund and that are more long-term. So we funded admin costs, salaries, and provided flexible funds for any of the short-term funding and emergency or crisis type funding that was required quickly and didn't need too much paperwork to process. We partnered with them also because we realized that the private sector, the local private sector, when it partners with local NGOs, some of the gaps are filled. For example, the governance issues, the systems issues, all those were taken care of. So by setting up this structure, I think it really has given us an opportunity to ensure that our funding goes straight where it is needed and that we are really using the funding, the grants, more for catalytic funding than anything else. Funding those things that we know the INGOs either cannot do or they cannot pivot quickly enough to be able to give to local foundations or local NGOs.
Yeah, understand. So I already asked you a lot of questions, and I'm sure people in the audience have many for you, but there was staying a little bit on the perspective of an African NGO leader. The last point that I wanted to hear your opinion on is how to think longer term about supporting really a strong NGO sector across the continent and what is needed there. And one interesting other initiative that you through APF have supported is a systems change pilot program that was dedicated to support a cohort of African NGOs or African organizations and to help them build their capabilities and capacity for impact. My understanding, our understanding is also to help them so that they could probably position themselves and become more eligible to receive larger amounts of funding. Yeah. When you think about the needs of nonprofits that you've interacted with and that you have funded or that you're thinking about funding, what types of support stand out for you the most that NGOs need or would benefit from in order to help grow the African philanthropy sector and its ability to give? What are the things that you would point to?
So I think to facilitate scaling, I think one important consideration is always the leadership. In any organization, you need a leadership pipeline that has the ability to translate strategy into steps and activities that can be executed timelessly, efficiently, etc. And for me, it's very important that that the kind of that when you do funding, to not only look at activities on the ground, funding activities, but also a human resource development, developing the skills, making sure there is a leadership pipeline that is capable of not only implementing projects, but also finding local partners, putting funding models that are creative and tap into your unusual sources of funding. That is very important. So in every budget line, I think your INGOs need to have I know Becky at the Philanthropy Center in Johannesburg doesn't like this term, but it's your capacity building. You need to actually put those funds aside. It allows you to, if you have to cut funding short, or if it's coming from a government, if you've built capacity, the leadership should be able to pivot and find opportunities for funding elsewhere. Or you are able to expose team leaders to how other organizations have done it, what has worked and what doesn't work. I think that's very important. And then to also build in a contingency budget whenever you're doing your giving, to try to account for every single cent to the T doesn't work. We all have contingency budgets on our, when we do budgets. But you find with a lot of NGOs, there isn't that. So again, the flexibility to respond to things quickly is limited because of that lack of flexibility. So yeah, I think those two issues are important in helping to scale. Thirdly, the African private sector is a very willing sector, especially local companies are a willing and a helpful partner in helping local NGOs be able to be stronger in terms of management and also governance, and also be able to execute projects more efficiently.
Yeah, again, I think all of that resonates. And we've heard this in many of the discussions also that led to the work that we've talked about. Tsitsi, thank you so much. I don't think you're completely off the hook in terms of questions, but at least from my side, I just wanted to say thank you. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I just appreciate how open and thoughtful you were. So I thought what we could do is to maybe first open it up for anyone in the audience that would like to ask a direct question. And then maybe in a second step, we could review a bit what's in the chat and to see whether there's some questions that we can then address from there.
Sure.
So is there anyone who'd like to ask a direct question to either any of us or to Tsitsi or to Mosun from APF? Sherwat has raised his hand.
Thank you. Yes, it's a she. Hi, my name is Ibrahim. I work at the American University in Cairo with Ali, and we're very proud of the Gerhardt Center and what's going on, and an amazing discussion, so insightful, so explaining exactly what it is that's happening. So really enjoying this. On the report, though, I'm a big supporter, of course, of local NGOs doing the job and doing the groundwork. I even have something on that. But the question is, did the report at all measure the second level execution? Because what might have been lost is that eventually, even if you're contracting, these private sectors or public sectors, in the end, I really believe that a lot of NGOs on the ground are doing the execution. So it might not be caught. And it's going to be very hard in the long term for transaction cost reasons to really resolve the issue that the report raises, that we need to increase the number from 9% or whatever more, because it's going to be very hard to do the business with these. So maybe if we put conditions in some funding agencies that they have to do it through execution through NGOs, like with a minimum of something, that can be a very practical way too. So I'm just thinking, but I'm very excited about the topic, and thank you. We're really honored to listen firsthand to Mrs. Masiyiwa. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Maybe take a few questions to see. Kennedy has raised his hand. Or her hand. No, it's a his, sorry.
Hi, good evening, Mrs. Masiyiwa. Thank you so much for such in-depth explanation of what's happening in the African philanthropy space. My question is around some African governments. They are suspicious of local philanthropists. How one navigate that to make sure that the catalytic work that you have raised or spoken about is appreciated, and governments actually pick up on that kind of work and encourage other local philanthropists to join into such catalytic work, especially if you look at what Delta Philanthropy is doing in the areas where it operates. Thank you very much.
Great. So we see if there's one more question and then find a way to maybe think of answering. Anybody else that would like to ask a question? See Chantal.
Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you, Mrs. Masiyiwa, for such a great conversation. Really enjoyed reading the report, which was very illuminating. My question is a bit sort of like different on something that was probably not touched on the report, but really the role of INGOs. I know that a lot of them, I work for Save the Children, and I think something that we've been talking about the long overdue changes that we need to make to shift the power to local and national actors. So we'd just love to hear your views on what role we could play. Thank you so much.
Great.
I can kick us off. My name is Maddie. I'm one of the authors of the report. Just speaking with the first question, which I think is a great observation around the fact that there may be funding which is ultimately landing up with local NGOs, but perhaps being passed through INGOs. I think that's a really great observation. Our data, just by virtue of the methodology, was only focused on capturing those direct grants. So you're absolutely right, we're not capturing any money that is ultimately ending up with more local African NGOs. So I think that's a really important observation. One thing that we did hear, though, is that there's still a bit of a power dynamic sometimes at play around the organization that is directly receiving the funds and therefore being able to, have a greater influence on how those funds are ultimately used, who they're subcontracting to, et cetera. So we heard that focusing on where is the money going directly is still, an important proxy or piece to examine. So definitely hear you that the full story is not captured, and at the same time, we think it's still quite striking that this disparity exists in terms of where the direct funding is heading.
Jan, can I just comment on the question on governments being suspicious? And
yes, I thought that was a great one to hear you, Tsitsi. Yes.
Yeah. So it's true that generally governments do get suspicious on motive. What is your motive for wanting to spend so much money on communities and through various philanthropic activities? And I think to some extent it's understandable, because the kind of philanthropy which where you're giving large grants can sometimes get in the way of what the government thinks private citizens should give and should not give towards. Firstly, then secondly, there's also I think the role of NGOs has pretty much been driven from the West, and the ones who get a lot of coverage and voice are those who are funding issues to do with liberties and freedoms of speech and human rights. So because it goes straight in and clashes very much with governments feeling that there's influence from outside or from third parties into how they govern. So you end up having that suspicion. So we have come across that. And again, the point I made earlier is that if we take a long-term view, building the knowledge around philanthropy, if we teach courses on philanthropy, if we have more researchers, if we have more journals, more case studies, we dispel the fears and we begin to get the governments to understand we are all on the same page. We all love our nations. And the reason why we do what we do is because we are patriotic. We are not trying to, to offend anybody. But I think that that kind of attitude and also message is coming out more strongly. And forums such as the African Philanthropy Forum and other networks have very much helped a lot. COVID, of course, I think was the ultimate in reminding governments that we all need each other. And I think we'll see less and less of that negative attitude and the suspicions that we've experienced in the past.
And yeah, and I would actually like to add to that. Thank you very much, Mrs. M, for kicking us off on that question. And as Mrs. M said, an organization like African Philanthropy Forum is doing a lot in this space. And we recently embarked on a project in partnership with CAPSI that has been mentioned quite often, as well as Trust Africa. And I know that Ibrahim is on this call it's an African Philanthropy Index project, which really tracks the trends in philanthropy and also measures the ease of doing philanthropy per country. So we know that it's easier to do philanthropy in some countries than in others. So we want to understand what makes philanthropy thrive and why government works better with philanthropists in other countries versus others, so that we can use those case studies as examples to get other presidents on board, and have them, thinking about philanthropists as partners in development, especially as we're racing to achieve the SDGs. Governments know that they can't do this alone, and philanthropists are strong partners in this regard. So that's a project that we're working on and we're excited about and looking forward to launching in the upcoming year, and hopefully we'll get some traction. And there are some countries that they actually have philanthropy in their national plan, so it's not just, it's not an afterthought. They are very strategic about how they engage with philanthropists in driving development in their countries.
Thank you so much, Mosun. I'm going to call back the question which Chantal shared around the role of INGOs. I think this is a great question, and certainly INGOs are important players in this ecosystem, and the role that they play in shifting power, as you've mentioned, it has definitely come up a lot in our research. So I'd love to start by getting your input on this, Tsitsi and Mosun, in terms of how do you see the role that INGOs can play in contributing to shifting power towards more local and national actors?
Mosun, do you want to go first, and then I will build up from where you leave off?
Thank you, Mrs. M. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is building capacity, because we find that a lot of INGOs come in and do all this work, and the local team are not empowered to make decisions. They're not empowered to deliver. They're not empowered to implement. And so when push comes to shove and they have to get out, the local team just is not able to deliver. And so they lack the expertise, the technical expertise to deliver on their strategy. So I think one way that INGOs can really make a difference is by knowledge transfer, transferring technical expertise and building local capacity so that the local team can actually rise to the level where they can take ownership in driving the vision of the organizations.
I think just to add to that, to listen, I think what we have witnessed in the last year is that there's been a lot of willingness to discuss difficult issues, topics, conversations. And that alone, I think, has led many of our INGOs to restructure their boards. Some are opening offices on the African continent, which is great. Also hiring locals, salaries, at parity before. I mean, in this day and age, you think this is unimaginable. But you'd have somebody who's a person who's hired locally has different conditions. I recall visiting one office in Uganda, which left me shattered, and really I couldn't believe it. I spoke to the CEO and the key members of staff. One was in Europe and another was in the US. And the local staff were sitting on plastic chairs in a tiny room measuring 3 meters by maybe 4 meters, a tiny little kitchen. And you ask yourself, so where's the money going? If this is what the local office looks like, and the international staff are sitting somewhere else. What makes me very happy is it's now unacceptable. You can't have a situation like that. And in 12 months, there is an understanding that human dignity is the same definition, irrespective of where you are. And that gives us a lot of hope in that the restructuring and the re-engineering taking place is for the benefit of the most important, the beneficiaries on the ground. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and very well said. Thank you. We can take a few more questions from the group. So I'll call on Chris, who I see has their hand up.
Yes, thank you so much. I've been listening to Tsitsi and Mosun. Actually, they have been speaking to what really I intended to raise, and that is the local NGOs' integrity, which is really lacking. And of course, I do hear about building the capacity of local NGOs to be able to command the confidence of either the private sector or foreign donors, and then believing in them that they can deliver. I hear, they talk about, being able to strategy, into actions that deliver results. But yeah, these are all long-term things. Wondering, from your experience in the field, how can we get this done? It's really a big challenge. The integrity of the NGOs is really not encouraged to really encourage private sector or philanthropists, local work to really believe in them and can commit for them to deliver. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We'll take two more. So Leela, please, it'd be great to hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Good evening from Cape Town in South Africa. And thank you to everyone for what's been quite a fascinating conversation. I think my main question really is around, the report was quite striking in the fact that the sourcing of funding for African NGOs in particular, and I imagine even more difficultly for African CBOs, is a major problem. And, part of my work is as a philanthropy strategic advisor to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we're struggling with figuring out a mechanism for how to share and highlight the great work that happens across our continent from institutions that are based on our continent. And it strikes me that perhaps there's some opportunity for African philanthropists to be able to speak with one another and highlight some of the organizations that they fund to one another, but also to be advocates on behalf of the African NGOs and CBOs on our continent when speaking with global philanthropists more broadly, in order to ensure that money sort of flows in. I mean, I know there's a whole host of other issues, but that was one piece. Is there some sort of possibility for that conversation to start happening? And then is there also a possibility for a more structured mechanism to be put in place where African organizations can be highlighted and celebrated for the amazing work that they do? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll take one more from Ali. I see your hand is raised.
Okay, I have one of them is a comment and the other one is a question, but there were two issues raised by Tsitsi. Now, the first one is, do we really have a Pan-African agenda vis-a-vis social impact, whether at Pan-African or even at the country level, or even at a community level? Do we know really what we need? When somebody comes with the money, instead of just dropping the money wherever they deem appropriate, no, I have an agenda, this is where you're gonna put the money. So my question, do we have this agenda? The other thing is, you've mentioned about democracy. When you look, I'm saying that this is about Egyptians, but it applies to all Africa. We're all the same misery when it comes to Africa. The typical citizen cannot find decent job, does not have decent living, does not have good food, does not have good health. Now, do you in hell expecting that he's gonna know how to practice democracy? I mean, anybody with the money or with the foreign whatever, they're gonna push him left and right. So we really have to work for at least a good perception, a good amount of time on the well-being of human beings. If you have human beings who are well educated, look in history. I mean, it has never happened with that when humans are in misery that you would have a proper democracy. I give you an example of Korea, South Korea. I mean, until the 1990s, they have bridges falling, students going in demonstrations, and army troops going against, against demonstration. When economy started getting better, the education becomes better, then they're fantastic now. So do you think this is the right approach, or do we really have to sort of worry about democracy and all that? That I think we would have to put a hold on it. I know this is a very controversial opinion, but anyway, I just wanted to get your views about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ali. So if we can tackle the first question which was raised, which was really around the integrity of the African NGO sector and building core capabilities related to governance and effective execution. I think this touches on some of the themes that were mentioned earlier around capacity building, but would love to hear Tsitsi and Mosun if you have any further thoughts on that notion of sort of building a strong African NGO sector.
Sure. Well, shall I go?
Yes, please, Mrs. M.
Okay, I think I can honestly identify with some of the frustrations around identifying where the NGOs are and having sufficient information to get to a place where you can actually celebrate. I think we need to partner, and I'm glad Ali Anwi is from the Gates Foundation. Let's put money together to build a database country by country of where are these NGOs? They are there, but there's no database. We built an alliance in Zimbabwe and identified probably between 150 and 200 NGOs. But imagine if we went country by country and had a good database, information, and then use digital tools to communicate, to identify, to talk, and what have you. We could really build a compelling community that tells their own stories and that we showcase, that we celebrate, and we have information on. I want to just quickly also talk about the issue of, do we have an agenda, and don't we need democracy? There's many countries, examples of many countries that were not democratic and found a pathway to increasing the standard of living. From China, we've seen that happen in China. South Korea started off not being a democracy. But what's important is the common vision. I think taking a long-term view to improving lives and having a common vision for philanthropy to use catalytic funding to find pathways to stimulate, to invest in strategies for economic growth and prosperity. Lastly, I just want to say quickly, if my great-grandfather was illiterate, had no clue of that there's a university that exists, probably owned one pair of trousers. My grandfather was equally as poor, but he understood my father needed to have an education. My father was a school headmaster. I went to university, did a master's. All my children, it's normal to have a master's degree. So each generation gets better and better. As Africans, let's celebrate where we have come. We've come a long way in a very short period of time. And I think we are in that place where if we can harness our energy, our passion, and our resources, we can give the 21st century we can take it as a real opportunity for us to make it the African century, where we'll see incomes rise and prosperity of Africans rise as what we've witnessed in China, Korea, etc. Sorry, I went to 3 questions.
No, that's perfectly fine. Thank you so much. Mosun, would love to bring you in. Any thoughts on any of those?
I can't top that. Mrs. M spoke with so much passion. Thank you. And just to add that, it is that passion that drives us at APF. And she recently challenged us, I think it was even last week or 2 weeks ago, back to this report. This report is really timely, and it couldn't have come at a better time. And one of the areas where Mrs. M challenged us is back to a lot of questions that have come up during this conversation. How do we give visibility to local NGOs? Because this report gives us the opportunity to do that as APF. We're constantly showcasing organizations. We need to dig deeper and find the organizations that are not blue chip NGOs, the grassroots ones, the ones that have no access, that would otherwise have no access to platforms like this, and to give them a voice. At least we can start with that. And of course, the database is just going to change the dynamics. And I think that's an important project that we need to work towards. But there are low-hanging fruits, which is just using our own platform to give a voice to the voiceless.
Thank you so much, Mosun. Sia, Jan, do you have anything to add from our side?
I just wanted to add on the question that was asked by Leila regarding the sourcing. I think one thing that we also did in the report was really place the onus on international funders to start creating those links and reaching out to African funders, because what we did find was that international funders did have sourcing networks, but it was an echo chamber of other international voices. So we did sort of have a call to action there to say, start forming those links and broadening your sourcing networks to account for African voices. And then also understanding that African funders themselves could have some blind spots. We've also, asked funders to really rely on NGOs, African NGOs that they've been able to find to act as a peer referral network, because they may have greater knowledge of what exists on the ground. So we've really had a clear call there for funders to really broaden where they are looking in order to surface more of these great organizations doing amazing work on the continent.
And Maddie, I think I want to add to that. Thanks, Sia. It's important to also speak to NGOs, because I know there's some NGOs on this call. There is nothing wrong with collaborating. If you're small and you lack visibility, there is nothing wrong with collaborating with other NGOs that have that leverage. The NGO community is largely fragmented. I mean, I'm in the NGO space, even though I'm like in the middle, it's a bridge between NGOs and funders, but it is largely fragmented. We have people reinventing the wheel. There is so much we can do if we come together. We can access more funding, give ourselves more leverage and visibility if we come together as a coalition on issues that we're of similar interest in. So to talk about integrity, I think it was Chris that raised the issue of integrity. That automatically helps with that. If you partner with other nonprofits that have credibility, they've been around, they're well known, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And NGOs really need to, they should treat their nonprofits as businesses. There's nothing, we're not different. It's just that we're not making profit, but they should be run professionally and efficiently, and not like, organizations that are, coming cap in hand. It's also how you present yourselves and tell your story. So I think it's important to, I don't want to use the word packaging because it sort of has a negative connotation, but I know of NGOs that have no substance but get a lot of money. And there are NGOs that are doing great work, but because they're unable to present themselves in a way that would attract funding, they're just lagging behind. So it's important that NGOs also take stock and examine themselves and connect to the right vehicles or organizations to move them from where they are to where they ought to be.
I think I would just add to, sorry, Tsitsi, please go ahead.
I just wanted to also say, I think to Mosun's point, we need to assist our local NGOs to have websites, to be on social media platforms, posting regularly. They don't have funds for graphic designers who, help them to tell stories. These are the things that I believe INGOs need to assist in building capacity and be willing to pay for. The NGOs that are getting all these prizes and recognition are the ones that have the right names of people serving on boards, people who are well known. They have a presence on social media. They can tell their stories better. But if we can find ways in which we can all collectively fund for these specific activities that have amazing impact and change the perception of the world and tell stories of impact, I think we'll be really positioning our small NGOs to also have a voice and be able to be positioned for more funding. Yeah.
I just want to highlight that point. I think coming back to, where you started off from, Tsitsi, when you spoke about what excites you about African philanthropy, you talked about the long-term commitment, the energy, the passion. If that can be met with more information about where that passion can be directed, other than those NGOs that you already know, that seems to me is a really, really important investment that's going to pay off. And the second line for that is, as you said, is to flexibilize the funding so that NGOs and leaders themselves can invest in some of those things that allow you to stand out versus just being able to execute the programs that you're being given funding for. I think those are two really important things. The only last thing I wanted to add is on this issue of transparency, of integrity of African NGOs. I think we heard both in our work. I think we heard from a number of funders that there's this delicate balance between trust being earned, integrity being demonstrated, that you have to keep in mind. But we also heard that for some African NGO leaders, they felt very strongly about the fact that they sometimes get held to a different standard than other NGOs, that they have to prove their integrity, have to prove their ability to deliver impact, have to prove their governance to a different level than others because of many reasons that we've talked about that are sort of embedded in these underlying biases. And so I just want to make sure that we don't forget that in this discussion, because that was a really strong sentiment that we felt had to come out in this work. But I think it's a great opportunity, maybe Mosun, I look at the time for us to close out, to give maybe people a couple of minutes back of their Zoom or non-Zoom life.
Thank you so much, Jan. Thank you. This has been an exciting and engaging conversation. I think this is one of the most vibrant conversations I've had on Zoom in a long time. There's so much Zoom fatigue. So thank you all for participating, asking questions, typing in the comment section. We really do appreciate it. Mrs. M, I don't think we should have titled this thing anything but a fireside chat because you were on fire. It was really fantastic listening to you, hearing you share with so much passion for the continent and, you know, development work. And it's not, the beauty of this is you put your money where your mouth is. Thank you for the amazing work you do for the African continent and for African Philanthropy Forum, and for sharing from your wealth of knowledge, giving personal examples and telling your stories. We're very grateful. Thank you. And to the Bridgespan team, thank you so much. I know we worked on this together, but you did way too much work than APF did. So thank you for the amazing contribution over the past year. I think I'm not sure we thought we'll be doing this 1 year later, but it took us about a year, I guess, with the pandemic and all, but we're here, we pulled it off. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Maddie, Sia, and Sue, that is not here. Professor Ali, thank you. I know you're somewhere behind the cameras. Thank you for hosting us and giving us a voice. This is our first public presentation of the report, and we're honored that we could do this on your platform. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I see a lot of Delta Philanthropy, Higher Life Foundation team members. I see members of the APF community on this call, and for everyone that joined for wherever, whether you're from the continent or you're just a lover of the continent, thank you for being here, and enjoy the rest of your evening or day, depending on where you are. I know that this is a monthly series, and Professor Ali did mention that there is an exciting speaker coming up next month, and you have it there. We're going to have the opportunity to hear from Denise Hearn, who would speak on from the myth of capitalism to embodied economics. It's on October 18th. Oh, okay, still this month. So don't miss that. It's not next month. Save the date and join the Gerhardt Center for another exciting session. So Denise has to top what we have done today because we have blown the platform. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Ali.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tsitsi. Thank you, John. Thank you, Maddie, and Sila, and Mosun, of course. It's been fantastic. Really, really fantastic. I mean, you can see, we have almost 60 people engaged across, more than an hour and 15 minutes. I rarely see this in any webinar. They get really fatigued. I think it's the energy, it's just being candid, saying what really is. I really appreciate it. And please, whenever you have anything you want to share with audiences, it's just we are a platform for you. By the way, I have nothing to do with the Gates Foundation. I'm with the Gerhardt Center. So I could use money as much as everybody else. Okay, thank you.
All right then, thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, take care.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tsitsi, again.